Okay, welcome back. We're going to talk about moral relativism today, and we're going to cover the basic argument from disagreement for moral relativism, and we will then discuss the more sophisticated version that I mentioned in class. There will be more in this video than what we were able to discuss in class, so do watch all of the segments. So this is the cultural differences argument, a version of it that is basically what James Rachels gives in the paper that you read. For cultural relativism, and I'm not going to go through the definitions of relativism versus objectivism versus cultural relativism because we did that in class, but the basic idea is that relativism just says that moral propositions are true or false only relative to a specified set of cultural beliefs or practices, and not absolutely. This argument begins just with the sort of mundane observation that different cultures have different moral codes. By the way, I'm setting up, I'm going to phrase the premises a little differently in this video than we did in class. You can choose whichever formulation of it you find more intuitive. If you like this version, use this one. If you like the one we did in class, you can use that one too. First premise, different cultures have different moral codes. Second premise, if different cultures have different moral codes, then moral propositions are true or false only relative to culture. Therefore, moral propositions are true or false only relative to culture. Simple modus ponens, right? And that conclusion is just another way of saying that cultural relativism is true. There are no objective moral facts or propositions. So this first claim, the first premise, CDA1, that different cultures have different moral codes, the defense of that claim is very straightforward. It's just uncontroversial observations that, early on came from early anthropologists and explorers, but these days are, you can see on online, National Geographic or in our philosophy papers that we read. We know that our culture has a particular set of values. We know that those sets of values are not shared across the world. And depending on which culture you're talking about, sometimes other cultures have radically different values than we do. So specific examples, you get lots of those in the Benedict piece. I mentioned she's an early anthropologist. Some of these are clearly moral. I think some of them are a little bit more like religious or spiritual. I mean, these two can blend together in interesting ways, but you can turn to her for some interesting discussion of those cases. And then the ones that James Rachels focuses on, he focuses on death and mourning practices in different cultures, burning the dead, burying the dead, eating the dead. These are all differences between cultures regarding how we respect those who have died. And then the one we've talked the most about is the infanticide case, the case of this native Inuit tribe that had a kind of systematic practice of the infanticide of certain female babies. We obviously in our culture don't practice that and disagree with their belief that that practice is permissible. So that's the first premise. That's really all there is to the first premise. The second premise just tries to draw a link between the reality of these cultural differences or cultural disagreements over morality and the truth value of moral propositions. If different cultures do have these different moral codes, which we just saw they do, then moral propositions are subjective, or they're true or false only relative to a culture. Now, the way Rachels lays this out, he sort of notes that we can cast about looking for a defense of this second premise, and there's not really much of a robust defense often. And, part of this is because this argument, I think, is sometimes not given by ethicists or philosophers. But I think part of it is that this version of the argument just isn't great. And he goes on to point out that, look, we haven't really been given reason to think that differences in cultural attitudes and practices must, in some sense, lead us to conclude that there's not a fact out there in the world. We might not be able to see it, but it could be that one of the two parties who disagree about, say, infanticide is just wrong. There's just someone's objectively wrong and someone's objectively right, and part of the disagreement is trying to sort that out, who's wrong and who's right. And Rachel's is like, look, this is a commonplace phenomenon that we see in other domains. Outside of morality, if you think about other topics, we know that cultures can disagree about things that both sides agree are objectively true. Both sides in a dispute over geography, to give his example, the shape of the Earth, think like it's either flat or it's not, right? It's not just a matter of opinion. And the fact that there are flat earthers out there, the fact that certain cultures historically and now have different beliefs about the shape of the Earth doesn't in any way shake our confidence that there is an objective reality about the way the Earth is shaped. So the point is, like, in general, it's not the case that mere disagreement about some proposition always makes us conclude that those propositions are relative or subjective. So why think that in the moral case? Now, you can think of that as kind of Rachel's both his objection to that second premise, pointing out there's not really a good defense, and then going on to say, furthermore, we know that this can happen, disagreement over something objective. And there's an objection there to the premise, and there's also a challenge. Like, hey, relativist, tell me what the difference between these moral cases and the non-moral cases are, such that disagreement about morality seems to lead us to relativism, according to you, relativist, but in these other cases it doesn't. Like, what's the difference here? Why can't one culture just be wrong, as they are in the case of the geographic disagreement? The